Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever we may find you. Welcome to Humanity Rising. I'm Leslie Southwick-Trask, the CEO of Ubiquity, and I'm coming to you from the original territory of the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot Confederation. The reason that I wanted to kick off today was because GDS is an initiative very close to my heart, as you will see with those that are joining me today. You know, yesterday we celebrated the spring equinox in the Northern Hemisphere. What happens in spring? Well, you know, the snow starts to melt. We look outside in our backyard. We see the boot that we couldn't find that the dog took out there and left. We find the t-shirt that nobody could find when they needed it. We find the pick for the ice that got left outside and couldn't find it when we needed it. All of a sudden, we see these elements that have been hidden from us as the winter snow dissipates and the spring arrives. It reminded me of the quote by Marcel Proust, which is, "The real journey of discovery is in not seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." And it was new eyes that we were given when Mary Olson was on this platform a year ago and presented to us the radical, disproportionate impact of radiation on women compared to their male counterparts. It was those new eyes that caused us to start looking at what were they referring to when medical research was being done, and uncovered that it's the reference man and not the reference woman, not the reference human. We started to say, then what else is there that we need new eyes for? And realized, as Mary taught us, that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals hadn't included nuclear. They chose to leave it out. What else did they choose to leave out? That was a question for us. And so, with the voyage of discovery of new eyes, we decided to look at the SDGs. And what we decided was that they had been written from the lens of patriarchy and colonization. That when the thing about it is, I'm an anthropologist, so I've been trained to look at life through a cultural lens. It's very much like going to the optometrist and they put those glasses on you and they keep flicking the different lenses, and some you can't see and some you can see much better with. That's what culture is. For those who live inside of it, it is what it is. It's deeply held beliefs and assumptions that we hold that help us make sense of the world. Culture is also our greatest blind spot. For those who live in patriarchy, it's a blind spot that has been enculturated and infused. For those of us living in colonization, it has been totally and utterly dominated in our psyche. So what happens when we take off the lenses? What happens when we discover that new eyes tell us something that we hadn't expected to see? And so it became important to us to not only address the absolute question of the origin of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, but to turn them inside out, upside down, and make them not SDG for us anymore, but GDS, Girl-Driven Solutions. And today we're exploring, where are we as we explore SDG 3 on health and well-being. And in order to open the space for us in the beauty of the First Nation, I'm turning over to Greer Atkinson, who is a member of the Chippewa of Georgina Island, who will grace us with the opening space of prayer. Welcome, Greer.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, if it's morning where you are at. I'm just going to take a moment and share my screen. I'll be sharing with you today a prayer, and I'm hoping that, there we go. I'm hoping it's for everybody to see. It's a prayer that was given to me by a wonderful teacher in my community by the name of Barb McDonald, and it's entirely appropriate. If I think that today is the first full day of spring where I'm at. And, one of the things that I really notice, especially first thing in the morning, is the sound of birds. And so this is a lovely prayer that includes gratitude for that. And so with no further ado, I'm going to read it to you in our language. You can follow along. The English translation is just below. And so miigwech ke gamishayan, miigwech mijam gamishayan, miigwech binashia gamwad, miigwech kijamnado kinagego gamishayan. And so with that, we thank for everything and all the wonderful things that we have. And so miigwech all, miigwech for being here and enjoying the space with us today.
And over to me. Hello, everyone. This is Hilary Van Welter coming to you from the traditional territories of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe people. And I probably mispronounced that, and Cynthia will hopefully correct me. I don't know if you can hear me or see me. Yes.
You're good, Hilary. You're good.
Okay, great. So I'm delighted to be here and as a member of the Girl Driven Solutions. And when we decided we needed to bring a different lens, we chose to do a makeover, because a makeover is a complete transformation or remodeling of something. And anybody who has been participated in or seen a makeover, and we've discussed a number of makeovers ourselves, there's something really magical that happens when the inner beauty that's been hidden or the inner essence that's been buried is allowed to come out. And so that's what we're doing with SDG 3. We're using a process that I actually developed as a technique doing healing work over 20 years ago. And when we asked characters, our feelings, to become characters, and they in turn started to tell amazing new stories or old stories that became part of intergenerational trauma healing. So the idea of creating personas and telling stories, of course, has been with us for eons. And so I've used that methodology in a range of ways, including using it for the whole area of outdoor space redesign and others. So when it came time to look at creating a undertaking a makeover transformation of SDG 3, we approached it in a similar way and said, if this goal were a woman, what would she be like? And what would her life goals be? What would her key characteristics be? Her personality, her friends and family? And so we started with what she would look like today, given the current targets and goals of SDG 3, as well as its update. And I'm going to be asking Cynthia, as Cynthia opens this session as the convener, to actually share with you what we came up with. But I am so thrilled and so happy that Cynthia is convening this panel. I've known Cynthia for 17 years, and we met in a group called Ladies of the Lake, who was a very provocative group to bring about an essential understanding of the waters of Lake Simcoe. We started out looking at, we were going to save the lake, only to realize that the lake was going to try and save us. And Cynthia has been provoking always before I met her and ever since. She's currently the chair on Truth and Reconciliation at Lakehead University, which has campuses in both Aurelia and Thunder Bay. But the other thing about Cynthia is that, she, as she says, she's quietly but determinately indigenizing places and spaces of inequity and exclusion as part of Canada's yet another decolonization journey. But Cynthia does it differently, and Cynthia does it while we know this is we go into discomfort, and we know we go into very uncomfortable places. Cynthia does it with knowledge, with wisdom, with humor, and with a twinkle in her eye that really allows you to get inside the discomfort and really know what it means for you, and then be part of the solution. So, Cynthia, welcome. Thank you for agreeing to convene this marvelous group to explore what does it mean for SDG 3 when we come at it from the Indigenous lens.
Thank you, Hillary. Thanks for all those kind comments as well. I very much appreciate it. Yes, provocative is a good thing. There's a lot of things about the work that we do in the world that's changing as time moves on, that I think we have to be provocative, we have to be bold, we have to speak up, we have to stand tall. And I think remind a lot of young women all the time, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, because there's been a lot of women that have gone before us that have done some incredible work. So thank you, Greer, for that prayer. And yes, Barbara was indeed a wonderful teacher, and we always miss our teachers when they leave us, because they're so essential to our good health and our good understandings and those teachings. So I wanted to start with something that kind of opens up the conversation in a way that makes a lot of sense to somebody like me because of the work I do. I work with lots of people. Part of my role as the chair on Truth and Reconciliation at Lakehead is to be a public educator. So there's lots of commentary, lots of questions. I hope all of you are familiar, at least to some degree, with what's happening in Canada with the Indian residential schools, institutions, the Indian hospitals that were set up to put Indigenous peoples in because they didn't want them in their own hospitals. And of course, more recently, the unmarked graves that have been revealed across the country at those schools. We knew that something like 50% of our children that were sent to those schools never made it home. Many of them were buried on the properties of those schools. Some of them died trying to get home and running away and froze to death. And some of them died when they got home from diseases like tuberculosis. So lots of things about that are really important that you understand, where we're coming from and why we think this conversation is important when it comes to health and well-being of Indigenous women. So I want to start with a short, I guess it's kind of poetry by someone. I'm sorry, I don't have the name of the guy. I forgot to put it down, but it was done by somebody with a good handle on why it's really, really necessary to delve deep and to wake up our unconscious, wake up our conscientiousness, so that we understand our role that we play and the gifts that we bring into this conversation. And we recognize the hurts that we all feel, and we share that we see each other's and understand that everybody has had some experiences with pain. But the trickster is a place of consciousness and a being of conscientiousness and consciousness. And the trickster says, we are foolish as human beings and we are wise as human beings. The trickster is kind of half human and half God. So it brings in this whole kind of conversation. So I want to talk about it from that perspective, simply because it is spring and the seasons are changing, and it's something of value that we need to think about. So I'm asking the question, what is the role of the trickster in a time of change? Well, civilization provides some stability and order in a chaotic and wild world. And a healthy fear of the wild is not such a bad thing, but too much rejection of the wilderness can lead to a rejection of our own wilderness, which is the source of our creativity. The trickster dances at the edge of the clean and the dirty. He shakes us up, calling us upon us to question those categories. And that's really what we want you to do today. We want you to question those categories of civilization, of wildness, of the wild women within, all of the pieces that make us who we are and make us interesting and make us take charge and do something about what we're seeing happening. So in my opening, I'm asking the question of you, and we're going to ask a question that we're all going to dialogue to, is why are we looking through an Indigenous lens? Well, partly because the Indigenous community has been through many changes and has lived in opposition to government dictates almost since contact, or maybe even since contact. We quickly realized the duplicity of armchair determinants, that somebody is making decisions about us and our lives, as they are doing with the SDGs, without actually ever speaking to us or knowing how we live. And we've always moved to a place of defiance when it comes to that. We see that the SDG number 3 on wellness needs and well-being of women has more often than not been much more of an afterthought from male power. And this has left our equally defiant girl-driven solution to come forward, which we've decided to represent in this conversation as the lie of Pocahontas, rather than as the tattered, beaten down, and ignored feminine spirit of the SDG, which initially came to us. We're not an afterthought. Women are never an afterthought. In our opinion, no women ever has been. There's a statement in Indigenous community that says it's not all over until the women's hearts are on the ground, and our hearts are not touching the ground. We want to discuss why we feel this way as women, as mothers, and myself as a grandmother. So the question I'm posing to Greer and to Taryn, and you girls, you guys should introduce yourselves as you come on, is what do Indigenous women bring to this dialogue on the SDG to bridge the gap between what is needed, what is offered, and what's likely to happen? And I'm going to hand it to either one of you.
There we are. Sorry, it takes a minute to, am I on?
Come on in.
There we are. Thanks, Cynthia. So, you know, I think when you say what is it that Indigenous women have, or what do we bring, you know, my mind immediately turns to my own childhood and where my belongings sat. And so I was raised both on and off reserve. My father came from Scotland, but was not in my life for a long period. So by the time I was 5, he had kind of moved out of my life. And my mother took my sister and I to the First Nation to live with her parents while she moved to Toronto to get herself set up, having a home and all the things that were needed. And I have distinct memories of coming into the reserve and knowing how much belonging I had. Like I have really strong memories of even sitting in circles with other women and girls who often handled me or you know, would do my hair, and made me understand without a doubt that I belonged. I belonged there with them implicitly. I never, ever got that feeling outside of my First Nation. And so one of the things that I often think of in terms of Indigenous women and girls is that power that we have to make each other belong. You know, we have slang in our communities and often talk about aunties now, which is really any woman of a certain age, but she's called an auntie because she belongs to all of those who are younger in that role. And so that's one of the things that comes to my mind, you know, when you talk about, you know, what do Indigenous women bring to the table, because it's such a powerful way of being.
Mm.
Oh, sorry, I did introduce myself a little bit. I just said I'm from the Chippewas of Georgina Island. I actually work in education. I've kind of fell into it. I've been there for about 18 years, but my credentials are actually not in education. So I'm not a teacher and I don't have that. I did teach and train adults through the business world in a role in banking, but my credentials are in marketing and human resources. And they've actually, they've been really good cards in my hand in the role that I've been in. And so that's a little bit about me. I'm also a mom. I gave birth to 3 daughters, one who is now transitioning into a they, them. And so I'm blessed with that opportunity to mom somebody through that transition. And so that's a little about me.
Cool. Taryn?
Hi, Ani, bonjour. My name is Taryn Johnson. I'm the Director of Indigenous Affairs at the University of Ottawa, and I'm also a mother to a 19-month-old daughter. I'm in Ottawa right now. When my mom was talking and after what Greer said, what occurred to me was that we're all relatives here. So we're all from Georgina Island First Nation. And we have these conversations around the kitchen table. Like this isn't a new conversation for First Nations women or Indigenous women to bridge gaps between what's needed and what's offered. Like that's something that I was raised listening to women talk about bridging gaps between our culture, what's needed and what do we offer, and trying to figure out how we're going to reclaim spaces as women. And I think that that's just a natural dialogue that Indigenous women are having all over the world, I think, how to bridge the gap between our culture and the dominant culture. So seeing these gaps, we're gap fillers. So we bring that to the table because this isn't something that's new to us. So I think that when conversations happen about really anything, especially I work at a university and it's a lot of the dominant culture, and we bring a new lens, we bring a refreshing new way of looking at it, because we don't come to issues in the same way that the dominant culture comes to issues, or that international people come to issues. So I think that that's really important, is that it's a new way of looking at things.
Yeah, and I think also the other thing I think that's important about that beginning is also the idea that the SDG, as opposed to the GDS, is that it looks at women as always needing help. that, that they're not strong enough, and that they need to be held up somehow, and that they're, when we looked at it, it was like, well, why is there an assumption made that women all over the world are somehow in deficit? That they can't do this, and yet it's women, who are the strong ones in a family. Quite often, they're the ones that, and they were necessary in every way, especially in the Indigenous community. And yet here we are. The three of us. We've all raised daughters. What's different about how you're raising your daughter, Greer? That and Taryn, and tell everybody what's different about what you're doing that the SDG is suggesting is important.
So I want to answer that, but I want to actually talk about how I was raised first, because it's really hard to see how you're raising. I think you're just kind of doing it. And so, I come from a really, women are strong in my family, and my mother certainly was too, very, very much so. And one of the things that I think both her and my grandmother often did was always talk in plain sight. Like nothing was really ever off the table. And we were always being spoken to about who and what we are. Like it just was how they operated. And so I know I do that with my own children as well. And they often talk too about who we were in relation to Canada, which made me understand who my place was. Like I have a distinct memory of being in grade 3. So I've now come from the on-reserve Indian day school, actually, into Toronto, into that school, and my mother's accompanying me to something, and I'm not even sure what it is. And so it's about 1978 at this point. And so I'm not sure what the conversation was in the news or how we got to this, but I can remember my mom taking me aside and telling me, by the way, in the day we were called Indians. And she said to me, "You're not an Indian," which confused me for a minute because she was. And I had been living with her parents, who were surrounded by a lot of brown faces in my reserve in the school, who had made me their own. And so I can remember standing there kind of feeling very confused about what she was talking about. And then she went on to talk about in Canada. Canada does not see you. You don't have status. So for those of you who may be attending who don't know, it was Canadian policy that if you were an Indigenous woman and you married off, she had married my father, you lost your status and your rights. My community never did deny my sister and I ever, which some communities did, anything. Like we went to school there, we lived there, we belonged there. But so that was sort of, I'm 8, and my mother's explaining Canadian policy to me and my place within that and why it's there. And so I think that's one of the ways, that is certainly in our family. We approach parenting. And so, and I think that's true too, of how I have always spoken to my own children, my own daughters, and now my kids, I call them now. Nothing's off the table. And we're very upfront about anything that's happening and what is impacting them as in young Indigenous, like they're very Indigenous looking. Their father's very dark, typical what you would think an Indigenous man looks like, and they all look like him. Which I think is a little unfair, to be honest, for all the effort you put in. But they're beautiful and they're very Indigenous looking. And so I'm often talking to them about the dangers of even just being what you look like and the response that you're going to get in this world. I can tell you that in grade 9, my eldest, who's now 18 and kind of well through all those tumultuous years, had a really horrible grade 9 experience on a few levels. In one of them, she ended up in a dicey sexual situation that got out. And, Indigenous women, we talked in the beginning about Pocahontas, are often over-sexualized and often considered to be, the tramp or the slut. And so my child, who's grade 9, has to sort of face an entire school talking about her in this way. And so, what do we do and how do we address it? I can remember just laying with her in her bed while she just sort of cried it out and understanding how in grade 9, you're so reaching out into that social element and all of those people are so important to you, and she's being crushed, and we talked through a lot of stuff. And what we ended up doing was building on her strengths. So she's got a great voice. She can really sing. And so we capitalized on that. She was in a good class. She was in a music class for grade 9, but we ended up moving her from that school because the situation was so painful into the local Indigenous high school major art school, where she was able to use that voice and build on it and become stronger. But I think, that's how I was taught how to deal with, stuff that's happening, like kind of meet it head on.
Yeah, that's that defines. Yeah, Taryn, you probably have something to say about that. I can remember I think all of our aunts saying to my daughters, because Taryn is twin, your mother's awful, isn't she? And she's not awful. And she says, well, doesn't she talk to you about like sex and all that? And she's like, oh yeah, she's awful that way. But those are the honest approaches to, you have to be straight up all the time. If you want to have strong children and strong women, you have to be straight up. Yeah. I don't, Taryn, you want to add anything on there?
Yeah, and obviously my daughter's only 19 months old, so we're not talking about things that are happening at school really yet. I mean, I asked her what happens at school and she's kind of like, she had a snack, I just wanted to, in the chat, someone asked what two-eyed seeing is. It's seeing through like more of a traditional cultural lens, and then also trying to look through more of a cultural paradigm lens. So that just, there's a lot about it that you can read about, but it's just that way of looking at things from two different perspectives. One thing that came to my mind when Greer was talking is that I'm teaching my daughter not to be like a good girl, the nice girl. I hear ever since she was born, people would say to her, oh, is you sleeping through the night? Are you a good girl? And for some reason that rubbed me the wrong way. The first time I heard it was at the pediatrician's office, and I thought, what do you mean, is she a good girl? Like, she sleeps how she sleeps. That has nothing to do with her goodness or her inherent, worth. And so that's something that I started telling her, was that you don't have to be good and you don't have to be nice. You have to be kind. You don't have to compromise the way you feel or lie or try to cover up about what's going on with you to please somebody else, to make someone else think that you're a good girl. And actually, when I was telling her this, and I remind her of this constantly, because people will say to her, oh, like, be a good girl, help your mom. And I say, no, she doesn't have to be good. She's going to help me because she wants to be kind. And we were with, we happened to be with a man. I won't get into details, but we were with a man, and he told me, don't say that to her. And I was like, pardon? And he said, don't say that to her. What you should say is this. And he was telling me what I should say instead of what I was saying. And I turned to her and I said, this is the kind of situation I'm preparing you for, is that I know what I'm saying. This isn't something that I just off the cuff coming up with. It's important. And to have a man tell me that wasn't acceptable and that I should be saying what he wants me to say, what proved my point in the moment, it was lost on him, but hopefully it wasn't lost on her, that no, I am saying what I mean to say. Thank you for letting me know what you think, but I'm going to stick with what I believe. And this is what I was very kind about it, and I hope that was a lesson that she can learn over and over again, because I mean, it starts young. She's a sponge, and to a certain degree we all are, but I feel like society tries to make us conform, and this is what this SDG kind of is doing too. It's telling you who you are, and we're not, my mom said, we're not victims. We're not in a fight or flight mode anymore. We're not in the place where things just happen to us, because that's a place that society likes to put women. She was a victim of sexual assault, like what happened with Greer's daughter. She was the victim. Things happen to women. But we want to change that narrative where women are the ones who make things happen. Like, your daughter is a survivor because of it. Your daughter is strong. Something didn't happen to her. Things happen in life, and she rose to the occasion. So I think that's something that I'm really trying to focus on with raising my daughter and myself, because you always have to keep raising yourself too, along with your parents,
Yeah, well, there's a reason why they say that our children are born to heal us, because it's our children that hold up that very powerful mirror that says, who are you? Because I want to know, who am I through you, at least initially, right? And then as they grow up, maybe the mirror reverses again. But, I remember saying to one of the other girls, we always think, if we're not raised with that strength, then we think that somebody else has to meet our needs. And we hold up our hands saying, meet my needs, meet my needs, meet my needs, which is something like that SDG. When really, we need to turn those hands around and understand that we're the only ones that can really meet our needs the way they need to be met. And we need to be clear about that. It's interesting, Taryn, when you said about the the Pocahontas thing. I mean, we switched from the Calamity Jane sort of person because, that's what it felt like, that all these women were being told that they needed help and they needed a certain kind of help. But also it was because there's a lot of young women around the world that, that whole question of sexuality and that whole question of how they live their lives is very much tied to their sexuality and who they are. And in the stories that are told to little girls, like the Pocahontas story, where you have this man who was at least 30 years old and this little girl who was, the record says she was about 10 or 11 years old, that he married her and that it was a good thing. That's an inappropriate union. And so it's really important for us when we look at these girl-driven solutions to say young girls do not need to be married off to older men. It should never happen. So we have to do something that shifts the lens on that so that they're protected from that. So, it takes on the persona of an endangered Pocahontas who died in childbirth, by the way, probably because she was so young, to make sure that we actually raise the understanding that women actually need to protect each other and I know they do, but how do we do it? Like, how do we light the fire of defiance in women in other places, because we pass that fire on to our own children because we choose to do so. But what's a good way, or what are you doing in your lives and in your careers to light the fire in other young women? What's the pathway for you? And Taryn, you're up, so go ahead.
Oh, okay, so for me, it's really paying attention to those that are doing the work. So I had mentioned that I work in education, and so I work for the Kinomadswin education body, which supports jurisdiction in education for 23 First Nations who signed an agreement with Canada in 2017 to take education out of the Indian Act and return it into their own hands. And so, we're a brand new organization. I was a part of that actually on the ground at the time in my community. I was the director of education for my community, and I worked hard to make sure that my community ratified that agreement. And so, there was a lot to be taught and a lot of reaching out. I do want to say that education in the Indigenous world is mainly in women's hands. It's primarily women at the table pushing. And so it was primarily Indigenous women in these 23 communities pushing for this. Actually, there was 40 communities at the time, 23 ratified, and there are more that are coming on board likely soon. And so I moved from that role in the community into a regional role, and then was given time in that regional role to work with the Kinamasman Education Body Board of Directors. Because I got nominated to sit on that board. And so I was given permission from my workplace, and then I got made chair. And so, that was a really great experience. I now am doing what I really love to do, which is actually work right with the communities. And so I'm in a coordinating role with Southern Ontario. What I do want to say is that the women in these communities and the men really find great importance in language reclamation and revitalization and in land-based learning. And so lots of people are really working hard to ensure that those things are being done in our communities, but also working hard to remove barriers and to create opportunities and partnerships with local district school boards. And so when you say, what are we doing, or what are you doing? Really, it's finding those, especially younger women. There are women in our communities who are teaching the language who are not fluent speakers themselves. They're so passionate about language, and rightly so. We will probably get into language a little bit more throughout this conversation, but language ties us to who we are. And I have such admiration for some of those women I see out there that to our ears sound fluent and probably really are close to it, but have worked really hard to gain a language that you can't pick up. Like if I was trying to learn Spanish, I can tune into Spanish radio, I can pick up, TV channels. I can go into communities where it's spoken. It's not an easy language to pick up. And so for those younger ones, both male and female, getting behind them is something that I find really important, and getting behind those that are trying to teach. So that's one way, I think, to address that question.
Well, Taryn, you probably have something to say about that, for sure.
Yeah, I don't sound fluent to anyone's ears, but I did pick up some of the language when I worked at Georgian College. I actually taught in the Anishinaabe program, because I worked with language speakers, some elders and some just traditional knowledge keepers who were fluent, and helped them because I have my master's degree. I could do the curriculum planning for them. But it's interesting. One of your children has a name in Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe is the Ojibwe language in Ojibwe, and I named my daughter and my dog actually. And I have found it to be like a really interesting source of dialogue with people, because they're like, my daughter and my dog, Odeamin and Andek, and they're like, what kind of names are those? And it kind of starts a conversation, but I think it normalizes things. And there's an art installation in New York that says, give your daughters complicated names, and it's under an underpass. It's this huge lit up sign, and it's a piece of art. And it is really important to like naming and language and things like that are very, very important, because it does carry strength with it. And you do carry, like the voices of your ancestors when you have a name like that. And I remember saying once, I'm an English major, just funny little anecdote that occurred to me. And we were talking about symbolism, like signs, like are words, obscure? Do they have even meaning? It's a big part of English language debate, critical theory. And I said, yes. And some people were saying, no, they didn't. And I said, your name is Adam. You walk into a room, every room you've ever walked into, it was the first man on earth was named Adam. Like everyone's heard that name. When you walk in a room like with the name Taryn, it comes with an explanation. It comes with a lot. I always have to correct my name. And I think that that's actually a good way that brings strength to is through language, is that you carry that. Yeah, you have to explain your name. You have to correct how it's spelled. You have to speak up for yourself. And I think that that's one thing that I've really tried to teach my daughter. And I work in Indigenous post-secondary. That's been my entire career. And I try to tell these young girls, it's a lot of like undergraduate students, they're shy and they don't want to say anything. And there's a quote that says, speak your mind even if your voice shakes, because it's hard to have a voice. And when it's been a long time since I was on maternity leave, and it's COVID now, but the students would sit outside my office at their little table in the Indigenous Resource Center, and I'd hear them with their little dramas and their, like things that are happening in their lives. And that's was always my advice to the younger girls, is that like, do what you want to do. If you don't like your program, if you don't like your relationship, if you don't like that kind of stuff, do something about it and make that move. When I was going to teach in the Ojibwe language program, I was terrified. When I was going to move to Ottawa, I was terrified. When I was going to get a divorce, I was terrified. When I was going to have a child, I was terrified. Like you're never not scared, right, to do something. So I think that that's something that I'll teach my daughter, is excitement and fear feel really similar sometimes.
Yeah,
and things are big. Things can feel huge until you do them. Everything's scary until you do it. Yeah. And then every time you do it from then on, it becomes a little bit easier. So
easier. And I tell people all the time, young women, take opportunities when they come before you, because it may not be the one that's going to make your life amazing, but you will have learned something from that opportunity, and you will be able to move on and go to another country, learn another language. I think for a lot of the listeners who are not familiar with Canada and what happened through the residential school system, I just want to share with you that language was one of the things that they tried very hard to kill, and to stamp it out, so that Indigenous people did not speak their languages, and they were very horrible about it. I mean, putting pins through children's tongues so that they couldn't speak, and beating them sometimes to death, when they spoke, because they were afraid, just like everybody else is. When we opened this conversation about not having any secrets, like being very direct. I was always direct with my children when I was raising them as well. They were afraid that they were talking about them, that they might say something about them. And when people are like that, when they challenge people, or they won't let them have their own life because they're afraid that they're going to say something different or do something different that they don't like, you're shutting people down, and you're shutting down your children when you won't allow it. So we encourage people in other countries that come to Canada, that immigrate, or whether they're migrants or whether however they're getting here, keep your language. Keep your language and ensure that your children have it, because one day they're going to go back to China, they're going to go back to Iran, they're going to go back to Mexico, and they're going to need that so that they can be embraced by the people where they come from. And those are really important considerations, I think, for anything. But that fear is absolutely natural. And it's one of the challenges, I think, of being human, is understanding get over the fear. Yeah, go ahead.
And it is something that has driven me into education for sure. I know a lot of words and I know a lot of phrases. I haven't taken the time to learn like I maybe would like, but I do, that the loss of language is something that sits very heavy in my heart because it did my mother. And so, Cynthia's talked about residential schools and Canadian policy. And so for quite a while, Indigenous people themselves stopped transmitting language to their children. And so, my grandparents did that to my mother, who often is sad because she could have learned 2 languages. So our grandmother was actually Mohawk. My grandfather was a teacher, and he met her, in her community, and then brought her home, which was interesting, I'm sure, for her, because those 2 nations kind of are at war. and actually, you can see that, yeah, and you can see that in the community loved her, but behind her back, and she knew it. She knew it so much so that when I was living with her, it was back in the days of the party lines. And so we had a specific ring, and I often heard her talking to her sisters in her own language. And by the time we had come around, when it was nighttime, she would lay with my sister and I, and she taught us to recite the Lord's Prayer in her language. And we often would be talking about animals. And, I don't remember many of those words, but I remember a few. My youngest daughter carries her name, which is she who carries the sky, which is actually she who carries the spirit world. But, going back to my mom, my mom really grieved not having that language because her peers spoke, I think. So she was often left out. And it really drove a lot of what I did in education, and still do. I pay a lot of attention to language. I'm, working very hard now regionally, trying to pull some stuff together to help continually advance, our ability to transmit that language, including working with language keepers that exist. And so, it's really, really key. One of the books I'm reading right now is by an author, Dr. Brené Brown. I don't know, many may know her. And she's written a book called Atlas of the Heart. And right in the beginning, I see some of the comments here about language is so vital. She talks about, so a lot of people don't actually know how to speak about their emotions. And so this book is about naming all of these emotions. But she talks about the power of the language that you use to help you understand your world. And, my mother made me understand from very young being that our language is how we understand and perceive the world. And so, for instance, in the English or Latin-based language, the language is divided between male and female. Not as evident in English, but certainly in French and Spanish. I mean, things are either male or female. In the Indigenous language, there isn't that male or female. In fact, an ex of mine who is born, his first language is Ojibwe, often talks about how, we're Canadianizing Ojibwe by often adding women or men to words, because we don't do that. He's like, it's not part of how we speak. We divide between animate and inanimate, so essentially living and not living. So there's one crucial peek into understanding a world through a language. Anyway, it's key.
I'll tell you a little joke that most people won't get here, but when I was teaching the Ojibwe language, it's not just animate and inanimate things that we would think are inanimate, like potatoes and corn are animate. And my students would always say, "Why are potatoes and corn animate?" And I'd say, "Because one has ears and one has eyes."
I think anybody would get that.
And it was my dad joke.
but very, very important. All right, so let's move on a little bit. So those are really really important comments, and one of the reasons they're important is because it is about transformation, and the SDGs and the girl-driven solutions are also about transformation. As Indigenous women, we fought for the traditional. We fought to maintain the languages, to keep the cultures, to reinvigorate the ceremonies. Like all of those things are about moving forward with all of the stuff that we know we need and our children need into the future. We've navigated the transitions from land-based work to cash-based work. I mean, that's all of the three of us here all work in universities or in institutions where it's about working with other people, not only our own people. We're working together to direct the transformation of our nations from the subjugation that they were subjected to sovereignty. You know, we want to see our people have the restoration of jurisdiction authority over their lands. We want to see restoration of jurisdiction authority over our children. And again, we could tell many stories about the experiences that we've each had when it comes to raising our daughters. And we don't have sons, but even ensuring that Indigenous men are restored to a place, because again, so much was lost over the course of that transformation. So when it comes to transformation, what are the kinds of pieces that you see your life work contributing to? And what do you see? What are the, how would we put that? We're in a transformation period. Where do you see your own work leading that?
Do you want me to go first this time?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So at the University of Ottawa, so I always kind of think like my professional life and my personal life, and I don't really, like, I see overlap in them, but they're very obviously doing very different things. So in my professional life, so I'm the first person to hold this title. It was created by the University of Ottawa in 2017. And I started writing an action plan to be, and we didn't know where it was going to go at the time, but it ended up being a comprehensive action plan that actually got rolled into our official strategic plan. And we released it right before I had my daughter and right before COVID. So we didn't get a chance to really like use it. So just coming back now, it's like I wasn't even gone. We just went right into consultations on it. And it's divided into 4 areas. And instead of using the traditional pillars, I actually used a teaching from Lorraine McCrae, who's former chief and now an elder at Ram First Nation. And she told me that when you look at a wigwam structure, and if people don't know what a wigwam structure is, it's like a domed traditional dwelling of the Anishinaabe people. And it's made using poles that go like this. And then there's hoop poles that go around it to secure it. So Lorraine said, individuals are like the vertical poles. They have autonomy at the bottom, but they all come together at the top. And that's where they find their strength. And then the hoop poles that go around the outside are like the cultural norms or the agreed upon paradigms that you exist in that relationship. So if it's, respect and honesty and kindness, some of the 7 grandfather teachings can be seen as hoops. So I use that as my structure. So the hoop poles are the 4 areas, and that's what holds the community of the university together. So looking back at what we wrote, I thought, like, if we can get all this done, we can change the lives of Indigenous staff, students, and faculty, like, immeasurably. Like, if we can actually have, we're changing the street names on campus to be Algonquin, which is one of the Anishinaabe groups, but to have their names on all of the streets, and all of the buildings to be renamed. So when you come on campus, if you're an Indigenous person and you see Indigenous language on campus, that might be a very unconscious boost to your ability to succeed in that environment, because you exist in that environment. Like Greer said, language is really key. So if you see that, that's something that's going to resonate with you on a deeper level than probably you recognize just passing by it. And to change the curriculum, to have more First Nations and FNMI hires, to have people who look like you teaching classes that aren't just Indigenous studies in all of the areas. We have more research institutes coming that are all Indigenous based. So that's something that I mean, it seems like small things when you're doing it, but I hope that 5 years from now, an Indigenous student coming onto campus won't ever have to doubt that they feel like they belong there. Because in 2017, there was nothing. There was just a resource center. And our team has worked really hard to try to integrate Indigenous content into all areas of the university. And it's not just this university, it's not just University of Ottawa, it's across the country. Every college, university, even high schools are changing their names. I know Greer knows was involved in the name change of a local high school by Georgina. It's change, and it might seem small when you're doing it, but it's a domino effect, and it's going to have an impact on young, like 17, 18-year-old Indigenous students coming onto campus. And hopefully that changes what the landscape of 20 years from now will be, because they're not going to be going to institutions where they feel like they don't belong. They're not going to be intimidated by the coursework because they see themselves in it. And who knows what that's going to make the future look like.
True enough.
Yeah. Yeah, it was an honor actually to be on that panel in the school naming it was the third one I sat on with Durham District School Board. And, the first couple, it was interesting because I felt like the board was really interested in honoring Indigenous people now. And I think that's happening in a lot of places. The first two schools, though, were in communities that had definite community. And so the names actually had to reflect those communities. Because if I thought back to, people, elders in my community, what would they say? They would want the name to reflect that community. In this school, it did emerge, and it was done in a good way. So that was a good one. So you asked the question about your life's work, and so it's always daunting to think, well, gee, what is my life's work? There's two things. I will talk about my work that I get paid for, but a lot of my life work is my children. And I don't think anybody can ever underestimate that for a mother. And so, and my mother's was ours, right? And so, that's probably the most impactful role you can actually have. And so I'll talk about that in a minute. My life work, though, has been in working with these communities. And so I started very young, actually, with Cynthia a million years ago, it feels like, in community consultation. And so, sometimes it's hard to see yourself, but a year or so ago, actually, Lorraine McCrae's daughter, who does quite a bit of work in Rama, pointed out to me, you're really good at holding and creating space for people. And so that's something that I do. And it is why I really like to be hands-on and working with the communities. And I really do enjoy working in education because there's a lot of work to be done in what Taryn talked about, indigenizing things. And so it started with our own school, where I picked up from another fantastic woman who had started in our small school. We have a very small school on Georgina Island, a K-5 school, ensuring that the kids were having land-based learning for 2 full days. And then not only just land-based learning, but connecting that to curriculum. And so First Nation schools are not Ontario schools. They're not, run by the government. And so we can do things that sometimes, public systems can't. And so Georgina Island's done quite a bit of work in that area, working not necessarily with Indigenous people, because that field is growing. We don't have all of the teachers that we need doing land-based learning, but working with some really knowledgeable people about being outside and wild harvesting and plant medicine and all of those things. And then we connected that to the Ontario curriculum, because these kids in grade 6 transition into the provincial system. And so what happened in our First Nation is happening in many First Nations, at least in Islamic First Nations around the Great Lakes. Many are moving forward with a lot of land-based learning. And so one of the most interesting examples I had the pleasure of being involved in was actually involved with Lakehead as well, Cynthia, but Beausoleil, Christian Island, through another dynamic woman from Georgina Island by the name of Carrie Ann Charles. She works in climate change. And for a long time was engaged in the work of gathering traditional ecological knowledge, but now works and partners with communities and many other partners in helping communities really look at monitoring changes to help mitigate the effects of climate change. And so that program that she's been doing in quite a few communities actually usually, or almost always, works with the arm of the First Nation administration that deals with lands. In this community, in the second or third year of the project, it shifted out of the hands of land into the hands of education. And then it transformed. And so a partner early on in that project was Chris, I'm forgetting his last name. He's a professor at Lakehead. Christopher Murray. And so he was really instrumental in getting, it's a wind and water monitoring project. So he was really instrumental in getting the science on the ground. So the wind and weather stations. Once it came into the hands of education, though, the women that are involved in that really put the push on for this to take on a whole new life and have that become part of the school curriculum. So in Christian Island, it's a K-8 school. And so we went about the business. I was able to, one of the partners at the table of ensuring that curriculum was being developed for the school that taught the kids, about water and wind systems, but also about how to monitor it. And then we developed summer programs. So oftentimes, when you're in a community and you're running programs for kids, because many women work now and can't be watching their kids all the time, you kind of have this little orphan group around the grade 8 mark that are a little bit too old for camp, but but not really old enough to work. And so we targeted some learning at them. And then we created Reach Ahead credits. We partnered with the local district school board for them to engage in a summer-long program in learning about water systems and monitoring water systems, and then engaging the community. And so we did that in part by funding through the Kinawadzwan Education Body, through a really exciting fund that actually is some of the most exciting work that I get to see or take part in. So part of what the Anishinaabe education system, so those 23 First Nations, what we have is a pot of money every year that is meant to develop projects just like this. And so many of the communities opt into creating land-based learning that is culturally based and connected to language. And so, that life work, I can't say I drive it, but I get to help ensure it happens. And I'm partnering with the communities to see that the curriculum is being done in a good way. I do have some experience in the curriculum development and really learning from each other. So what are we learning, and how do we translate this, and how can we share this information with local school boards and other education partners?
What you both made me think about when it comes to models is something that also everybody should be familiar with, Maslow's hierarchy of needs model, right? And everybody uses that. You're taught that in school, that you have to start with the basics and then you move up, and then you get to self-actualization at the top. But the interesting thing about that model is he actually took it from the Blackfoot Nation out of their teepee teachings. And really what the Blackfoot Nation's teaching says is you come into the world self-actualized. And the whole goal around your life is cultural perpetuation. Like you're continuing the culture, and that's exactly what you're doing. You're saying, yeah, okay, me, myself, and I can do certain kinds of work, but it takes a whole community to lift the knowledge base of the community, and the women are driving this forward. And so, I mean, those are really important, I think, differences between when we say, why are we looking through an Indigenous lens at this? Because we understand that it takes everyone to be a part of this conversation to make change happen and transformation happen. Whereas if you're trying to do it all by yourself, or you think that you're the one with all the answers, instead of doing something for everybody, you're flying yourself to the moon or Mars or wherever the heck he's going. So there's a real big difference in terms of our orientation to where we want to see this going and why we wanted to see go in the direction that we do. So there's other kinds of things that we can talk about. The other thing is this session is about humanity rising. So it kind of led me into that sort of thinking, like we're trying to do this thing where we're lifting all of humanity. And I think Indigenous peoples have been very clear about that the work that they do is for their people, and we want to, obviously continue our cultures. But when we protect the water, it's not just for us, it's for everybody, it's for humanity. So I think that that's important, and our people have been rising. The days of being corralled on those reserves or those reservations in the United States, locked out of education, we're still grappling with the overrepresentation and incarcerations. Again, for those of you that are not from Canada, don't understand, we have hugely high rates of incarceration for Indigenous youth and women. And I think it's associated to the fact that we don't have a lot of jurisdiction authority over our children. We're still battling with the children's aid societies, and the children are still being stolen from our communities. So I guess, in terms of some of the comments and questions, what do you want to share with the rest of humanity about, your personal journey? Certainly, again, as mothers, it's important. The journey of your parents, we've heard some of that. Our grandparents made it possible for us to be such significant parts of this transformation. They gave us the gifts that we actually are utilizing in the work that we do. And what would you say, you found that actually works the best? What has never worked in your estimation when it comes to creating profound and lasting change? What would you offer up for people to have a better understanding of?
The last thing you said before we just move on, when we're talking about language, that's the really interesting thing that occurred to me is when we say we're Anishinaabe, or people say that they're on the territories of different people, in our languages, all those words mean people. They don't mean like an Englishman and like you're identifying by like the country you're in. And before people started asking like questions, I remember Ernestine Baldwin, who's also an elder in our area. She's from Shingamik First Nation, but she lives in the Barrie area. And she said, when I was younger, she said, if someone came Mohawk, or if they were even from BC and they came and we'd say, who's that? And then she said, my father would say, oh, they're Anishinaabe. But like now we use that to mean us, but at the time it just meant, oh, they're part, like they're people, they're part of the people. I thought that was interesting because you're right, we don't think about it like that. We think about it in terms of humanity. And that, that kind of looking to your parent and to your grandparent makes me think of the question that you just had. This is Cynthia is my mother. And her mother, my grandmother, went to residential school, and so did her father. But I'm talking more about from the women's role, because I now have a daughter, so now my mother is a grandmother. And I think that that's part of the key, is that it's healing by healing yourself. So my grandmother did a lot of work over her life. It took her whole life, and it spanned part of my mother's life and her healing. And my mother did healing with her mother while also raising a daughter. And then I did healing while also with my mother, and then now with my daughter. And I think that that's kind of another way of looking at how we look at things holistically. Like, it's not I'm healing and I'm doing something and this is my journey, and then I look at my parents as being separate from that and my grandparents as being separate from that. It's this continuation that happens simultaneously of healing and moving forward. And I mean, the thing that popped in my head that my mom's going to give me a look for is like that the Maslow made me think of the triangle of like the idea of maiden, mother, and crone, which I'm so sorry I didn't want to use the word crone. the mother, daughter, grandmother ideology, but working together like that kind of, and that's how we look at community too. Like Greer was talking about aunties. It's not individualistic in any way. So it's a process of working together, and that kind of journey that's not a solitary journey, that you're taking these things on by yourself, that we look at things as a community. And I think that that's something that Greer has really made clear, is when we talk about doing work, we never do it without our community. Like Greer says,
or at least with them in mind.
Yeah, with them in mind, we take everything consultatively with our community. We bring everyone. It's not just one person who's successful, who's done it. It's we always acknowledge where we came from, our community. We always say where we're from. We always say who our parent. People say, who's your mom? That's part of our community too, because we don't do things alone. We do things together.
Yeah.
And that's 7 generations, right? 7 generations back, 7 generations forward.
Even as I've been talking examples, I'm calling out the women who were part of that success. It's not your success is never you. It's always in collaboration with others. In answer to your question though, I really feel that connection to spirit is so important. And in a couple ways I want to share. So it's understanding the spirit of those communities. I had the honor of working on a curriculum project that built on it was already an existing project of books about each 6 communities that I had been working with at the time. And they were already 6 books of about 30 pages each. And my job was to go and update them. They had been done in 2002. And we worked with Nelson Publishing, and we moved them from 30 pages to 70 pages. And so one of my favorite projects ever to work on, because it was my job to go into those communities and find out what they wanted to talk about of themselves. And the difference in between that set of books from each community is quite profound, but it's tapping into the spirit of that community. I do want to also come back to another thing that my mother often taught me, is that spirit is so important. Cynthia and I, our grandmother was, spirituality is so important. We had Christianity kind of come into our communities, and I do know in my whole life, I've watched how spirituality and connection to spirituality shifts people in good ways. Our grandmother was a Jehovah's Witness, which was like, and it was really interesting to be part of her world, because she was allowed to be that in our family, but no one else ascribed to it. So it was actually quite interesting to be around her. But, through that, she was able to teach a lot of spirit, actually, to me, through her stories and through her examples. My mother is very anti-Christian. She didn't actually teach hatred about it, but she'll say, that's scripture talk. And at my funeral, there should be no scripture. It's like she doesn't really ascribe to it, but she will talk to you always about that real spirituality and all of that stuff that exists in church as much as it does within our own culture. And so as I was growing up, and as she was growing up and maturing, a lot of her pursuit, a lot of what she was after was better understanding that. And also teaching us at the same time. So she was often talking about policy. She was often talking about the Indigenous place in the world while working on addictions and understanding Indigenous traditional ways and approaches through spirituality, and introduce that to us. So, my sister and I grew up very comfortable with, we always open with a prayer, and often with a smudge, and we use medicines quite regularly in our lives because of that. My own children, and especially the one I talked about at the beginning, the opening, the one who is transitioning to they, them, really has cottons to that. So when she was a she, it's hard actually sometimes to wrap your language around what they are now. But when she had her first menses, she immediately told me that she wanted to do, and so she was still being identified as a she then, a berry fast. And so that's a coming of age rite of passage for Anishinaabe girls, where they take a whole year and they give up berries. And they give up a number of other things, and they really study their own traditions. And she asked for that herself, so they asked for that themselves. What was really interesting was that we couldn't take it as far as we wanted because our those teachers that we haven't caught up to what seems to be emerging in Canadian, and I think really in many of the developed countries around the world, there's a lot more fluidity in terms of sexuality. And we haven't really caught up to that. But I find it very interesting how much that child of mine has taught me about us and about what that means, and so I'm still unfolding that with her. But that's very connected to spirit of culture and spirit of identity. And so spirit, connecting to spirit, like I connected to the spirit in those communities to make those great books, is really, really key, I think, in all that we do. And if we are to transform anything, we always must be connected to spirit in whatever it is that we're doing.
Yeah, those are important concepts. There are words for those things in the language as well, but that sense of connection and giving, and it's one of the things that we really grapple with, for somebody like me that's worked a lot in the child welfare stuff, is kids that they take our children away, and then they're severed from that sense of connection. And it's really hard to recreate that, in a 20-year-old. They just feel very lost. So this idea of having those relationships from birth even prior to, really, because as we've said, it's a 7 generations back, 7 generations forward thing, which means that we're all connected. And that's why we often talk about that intergenerational understanding, that intergenerational effect, all of those pieces that are a part of that conversation. They're asking, I see, asking about the Angwahangwe and band council things, and those are really big conversations. The differences are quite legal. There's the Longhouse, and then the band council is really a creation of the federal government through the Indian Act of 1876. So there's lots of conversation there that it's really not really going to be possible for us to talk about. And in the seventh fire, that's about spirit. That's what we're talking about. It's about prophecy. It's about understanding that you were seen. The Western world was seen before it got here, and that our ancestors understood that they were coming, and they understood that there would be choices that needed to be made, and they understood that sometimes those choices were out of their hands, and sometimes they were in their hands, and they were able to do something about it. But they understood that there needs to be a preparedness. And spirit is a part of that conversation, which is why when you mess with us, which has been happening through the course of assimilation and residential schools and marginalization, that it's why when you look at Indigenous peoples globally, and about 350 million Indigenous peoples globally in about 70 countries, and you see them struggling, it's because you've taken so much away. And we're constantly in this gathering mode of bringing these things back into the same space. So that fire that we're in the seventh fire where our youth are rising, and your youth, if you're European, are coming to us now and saying, teach us about the land, teach us about this wisdom that you have. We need to understand it, because the eighth fire doesn't get lit really until we all come together. And that's not where we're at. I mean, we got a war raging in Ukraine. We got wars happening in Yemen. And we're not there yet. And it's a time when we all have to make those kinds of decisions that bring us to that place. And I have faith I do. I have faith, and I know we all do, but it hasn't been an easy road. And I think we're doing it's the women that really need support. So bringing it all the way back to the whole question of the Sustainable Development Goals, they're not sustainable until you actually listen to what the people have to say about them. And I don't mean the people at the top. I mean the community that makes up the global population. They have to be heard, and that's something that's not happening. And as far as girl or women driven solutions are going to happen, I think there's only one way to do that again, and that's for women to raise their voices. You are strong. I just did a conversation the other day, and John Trudell, he wrote a book and said, we are power. And that's the message. I want to ask Greer and Taryn to, share a message for you that will help to, close off our part of this conversation before we move to the other chat. But I want you to understand that we are power. So Greer, you're up. I'll hand it to you.
Okay. When I think about this, I think about our community, and I think of the work that I've done both in my personal life and then in my work environment. And it's not always easy working with people that have been really traumatized. Especially, you can belong, but there's parts of you that don't belong if you and your family weren't as traumatized. And so, I personally, my mom was a good mom, and I was safe. And her parents were that to her. And that's really visible to people who are traumatized. And so they often look at you a little bit differently. And so it's a little bit of a different, you have to learn how to work around that. And I think, the advice I would give to any woman or any girl who's wanting to move and shift and transform things is that you don't necessarily have to put a coat of armor around yourself to protect yourself from, traumatized people. Like, when it's not in context, it often looks like somebody's personality traits or the traits of a culture. And it's not, it's trauma speaking to you sometimes. And so I think it's really important to carry and keep your heart open to everyone all the time, and to take a kind view of yourself, because it can be challenging. It can be challenging because you can be made to feel smaller because those are people that your light is shining for them, and they want to clamp it down. And so I think for me, it's really being kind to yourself and understanding, what your fire really is, and staying within that realm of what I talked about in the beginning, that love, that belonging, that was actually the true spirit of the women in my community. And so hanging on to that.
Yeah, Taryn.
Greer took the words right out of my mouth. Everything you were saying, I was like, yes. Like I said earlier, I just feel like society in general, you're talking about the traumas, you're talking about, and I completely agree with everything you said. That's what all these things that you see that look like things that just happen, or sorry, I have a puppy, things that just happen, or things that people just say, or things that's the way they are. It isn't. A lot of the time it is trauma, it's learned behavior. And it's time for us to heal each other in that way, like to not remain in this survival mode that we've been in. Like my mom said, this has been generations of Indigenous people being put upon and colonized, and genocides and things like that. And it's our time to help each other heal. And that's what a lot of women bring to the table, is that kindness, that compassion, that gentleness. And that's why when we find strength in each other and we build communities like this, that's how we can take that to especially to the youth and to people who are traumatized, and to try to help to change that. And I think that the only thing I would add to that, which, is part of what you're saying, but just in addition, is that no one's ever alone. Like I think that people feel really alone. They think I'm the only person that this has ever happened to. If they're dealing with mental health struggles, they think there's something wrong with me because I'm the only person who's ever felt this way. I'm sure if your daughter didn't have you as a mother, they would think I'm the only person who's ever felt like I didn't belong. And our society does that to people. Our society wants people to feel like they're individuals, they're on their own. Everything that happens is up to you. If you're in a tough situation, it's because of your actions. And we don't feel that way. And I think that that's something that really needs to be brought forward, is that no matter what your background or your culture is that you're not alone because you're part of a global community, and there are people that care about what you're going through, and there are voices that will speak for you and with you. So that's the last thing that I would say.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that was great. Like, I really appreciate your words, and I hope that was useful to everybody that's sitting with us. And I know I see there's a lot of questions and comments that would like to be answered. And, as I said, we're called upon a lot. You need to understand that we're called upon a lot to do those kinds of teachings across the board. And it is a lot of expectation, but I've said to other Indigenous peoples, we're going to have to do it. We're just going to have to do it and keep doing it until it's, we get to this place. And, somebody mentioned the eighth fire being something that gets lit within us. Yeah, all of those fires are within us. The question is, can we light the fire as an entire civilization and actually come to that place of being together and being connected? We'll see. So I'm going to hand it back to Leslie and Hillary. And thanks, guys. It was great.
Oh my gosh. Well, stay on with us because this has been an absolutely fascinating dialogue. And before we go to Rebecca, I just want to raise, why did we choose health and well-being as the first SDG? There's 17 of them. So why did we choose health and well-being? And it came from the absolute insane journey that my daughter-in-law had to go through when she lost a child in the second trimester of her pregnancy, and how she was treated. And she is my race. And so I can only imagine if she didn't have that privilege, the way she was treated, how she had to navigate holding a dead fetus in her body for days and days and days until she had to go to an abortion clinic to have the fetus removed. She was treated in a way that was unbelievable and unacceptable. And it was in 2022. So when we think about health and well-being, and when we think about the patriarchy of ways in which our healthcare system is built, and how you've brought into our voice the strength of who we are as women and the strength of who we are in this moment in time, I think that you have lit a fire continually for us. So I want to just reach out to Rebecca, one of our co-founders of GDS. What have you been listening to and hearing about as we went through this wonderful dialogue?
I just want to thank everyone here for your time and attention, and really such beautiful offerings to this space. So thank you, ladies, who've been here with us speaking, and to the audience members who have been listening and asking so many questions. So as I was listening, for me, this brings up the idea of intergenerational trauma, decolonization, and self-determination is where my mind goes after hearing the wonderful sharings that we were offered today. So I know those are a lot of big words that we kind of throw around, but I'll try to break them down really quickly. When I've been thinking and looking in this space, I will throw out another word that's all the buzz right now, but intersectional. And I think it's really, really critical and important. And what we heard today from these amazing women is this idea that you can't just pinpoint one small thing. We have to look at things holistically. And that really means, for me, that means looking at intergenerational trauma and decolonization practices, and making sure that we're looking at self-determination. So that means the communities that are most impacted, are we going to them and asking them what is needed to make it right? Not the person who did the harm being like, oh, I'm going to go do this to fix it. What is a restorative way for us to correct harm and to be in community with one another and to come together around these ideas of healing and what that truly means and what that truly looks like with this intersectional lens. So for me, health and well-being is really the first step. And thank you, Leslie, for sharing why we chose this. And for myself, it was so important because I feel that this is our first step to really coming together. We have to be able to look at these intergenerational traumas that have been inflicted upon each other in multiple ways, in multiple generations across time. And we all have that within us, no matter what color skin we have or what color we've shown up. There is trauma. So if I believe it was Greer who was talking, but how can we understand that? It's not the personality, it's trauma almost always speaking and making decisions. So that was what I saw and what I hope that we can continue to look at and move forward into. Thank you.
Wonderful. Hillary, you've been listening with that crazy, beautiful mind of yours. What have you discovered?
I have to say, there's a Chippewa word that comes that Cynthia gave us many years ago to name a film project with Ladies of the Lake. And it's Ajigaman, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it means, it's a concept meaning changes everything. That, and I think this conversation for me changes everything in terms of understanding that this woman who is now rising was already self-actualized when she came into the world. She was fully in full form, all ancestry flowing through her veins, at the same time potential of prophecy, and coming into the forefront with this amazing open potential of such fascinating possibilities. And so she rises tall, but she shakes before she talks, because it isn't easy to do it. And she gets nervous, and she gets excited, and she gets fearful. She's real, but she says it anyway. And as she speaks her truth, others come to speak truth with her, because she bridges the cultures. She provides the bridge that allows for many teachings to come, for many thoughts, and because we all share the land and the water and the air, and we come through it with our fire. So it's bringing that essence in and understand, and I love the idea that how much spirit plays in moving her forward, in understanding that she comes again from a place of spirit being whatever form it's come in through. Is it religious, through science, through wherever it's come, and it is shaping what she experiences in life, animate, inanimate, and that she looks to language as being something that is a vehicle of change, that becomes a way of expressing ancestry. It becomes a way of expressing exploration. It becomes a way of expressing future. It becomes a way of many, many different voices coming together. So I found that the one thing that I'd like to also sort of finish with, that I heard from Greer at the very beginning, was she also brings a deep understanding and practice of belonging. And that sense of belonging is something we are all searching for. So while she comes in self-actualized, she is on her journey of belonging. And as she seeks belonging, as she explores belonging, she will discover so many different opportunities, so many different things, share different teachings. But she is here as this beautiful rising spirit that is here, that has had trauma. And understands she works with the idea, but trauma underneath it is, when we unfreeze it, is energy that is of the most highest and of the most best and of the most divine. So she's bringing in these amazing opportunities to bring divinity, spirituality, prophecy into this little box we said was health and well-being. She's just blown it apart. That's what I heard. Miigwech.
So, yeah, geez, how do you follow that? That was just so crazy. No wonder we came up with GDS. That was Hillary's like crazy mind that said, let's just reverse the letters. And then, as we just discovered, how she takes us into the reality of what is, because we've just declared it. It is. It isn't going to be, it is in the now. And so I just want to just turn to any parting words from each of you. So Cynthia, what would you like to leave us with?
I think that we are so much more than we have been represented as in this country and really around the world. We have lots of gifts that we're reclaiming, that were hidden away. Some have done by our ancestors who said, we're going to keep this, and because we want to keep it, we're going to hide it. That are coming back and opening up. There's a lot of reclamation going on. So we are so much more than we're represented, and I want people to understand that.
Taryn.
I'll keep mine short because there's a dog squeaking air in the background. She just stopped, thankfully. It's like she knows. I guess I would say that I just really appreciate everyone else being here and the organizers that the work you've done. They say that we all contribute to the global consciousness with our literature, with our films, even with our own words and with our own emotions and our spirits. And I think that just everyone that came to this is so positive and forward thinking and engaged and open-minded, so that we're contributing good things to the universe. So I just really appreciate everyone being here and just being engaged with what we're saying and listening all the way through and actually taking what we're saying into consideration, and to you for giving us this place to do it. So thank you. Miigwech.
Rebecca. I'm going to get you, Greer, I'm going to ask you to finish with a prayer. So if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Rebecca, so while Greer's getting our closing prayer, Rebecca, what's your final thought for us to consider?
Thank you. I put into the chat, I've heard in the chat, there's a lot of talk about sustainability, and I just wanted to offer a reframing that to sustain means to maintain what is. And we're really talking about transformation and about maybe bringing back traditional and ancient wisdom. So I'm a lot more attuned to the word regenerate, which I think speaks to what we're talking about here. And I offer that to the audience, that as we move forward, we talk about regeneration instead of sustaining what currently is.
And Hill, you're on mute.
I think I know that by now. I'm just so grateful to Cynthia and Taryn and Greer for such wisdom, but wisdom spoken with reality, wisdom spoken with such clarity, wisdom that wasn't put into academic terms or it was told us in plain speak, and like it's been hiding in plain sight. And I just want a deepest thanks for such wisdom, such sharing, such vulnerability in sharing your own personal stories. And we are so enriched by it. And I too would like to applaud our Rebecca for bringing regeneration back. It is regeneration. All life matters. It's contributing more, not just sustaining what was. Thank you.
And as we wrap, and I'm just going to say that I found reading a book on regenerative business this weekend. Regeneration is disruptive innovation. Disruptive. So GDS is disruptive innovation. And continue on with us. Our work has just begun. We're going to navigate some more of the white waters as we bring new eyes, new lenses into this moment. And I'm just going to say my closing piece, because I'd like the circle to be closed by Greer. Tune in tomorrow. Now for something completely different. I mean, this is the beauty of Humanity Rising. You turn on each day and there's another thought. Guess what tomorrow is? The Iran-Contra case. So if you want to find out more about that, then tune in tomorrow as we explore that particular journey that has taken place in our world. And so to close our time together, I hand it over to Greer.
Okay. So I am going to say for you something that has been developed by the Anishinaabe Nation to address, we say it every time we open, especially open meetings, but I do want to say, Cynthia started off with a comment about Indigenous women, and it's not over until our hearts are on the ground. And she talked about the fact that our hearts are not on the ground. And in fact, Indigenous women, as she sort of alluded to, are very much strong in the game and looking to collaborate and partner with others in terms of all that we talked about today. And so I'm going to read you the preamble of the Anishinaabe people, which is all about asserting who we are. And so what I'm going to say to you in the language, I'll quickly translate now. It's about understanding that the Anishinaabe people were placed here, and we were placed here with original instructions. We are here to look after the land, the earth, the water, and the wind. That is our job. That we are here with our own, it's like a constitution. I'm struggling to figure out the word in English. We are here because we are here, and we belong to nobody. We belong to ourselves. And we were given the ways in which to enact that through, some of you may hear of our 7 grandfather teachings, which you'll hear me name, and that we are here to be here as we are and as we always shall be. And so I'll recite that for you. So this is called the Nagodua Nagazid, Anishinaabe. The Benjaged Gisan Anishinaaben a king. Gibidagon Gedene Minadowadswin. Shkode Nibe Ke Noden. Gibida Gustanan Winan the Wendamang Mampish Kakamagang. The Benjaged Gimenan gets twa Wendagag Anishinaaben Wanag Donjin Ninda Nishwaswe Kinomad Winan. Zagadwin. The Buewin, Nadendamwin, Wakwawin, Wadendidzwin, Wakwadzwin, meanwhile Akadewin. The Benjaged Kiminagona de Benwe, we Nagdewendwin. Ka Minadendana Giabe, Shwebug, meanwhile Nango, Megwa, Ishwebug, meanwhile Giabe, Wa, Ishwebug. Miigwech.
Thank you, one and all. See you tomorrow. Bye.